Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Inside the Pod from the Processors and Growers Research Organisation. I'm your host for today, Ben Pike, and I'm joined today by Charlotte White from ADAS. Good afternoon, Charlotte.
Hello.
Charlotte's here to talk about the Yield Enhancement Network, or as most of you will probably refer to it as the YEN. That's what we're going to refer to it as for the rest of the call, because that's much easier for me to say more than anything. But we wanted to raise this as a topic for the podcast today, because it's a really important program that growers can get involved in across the arable sector. Obviously, with our pea and bean hat on today, we're going to be talking about those particular YENs. But they do add a huge amount of value and insight into how you grow your crop and give you pointers on how to improve on your yields. So Charlotte's joined us today to sort of fill in some of the background as to how they work and why growers should get involved. So that's probably a decent place to start, Charlotte, if we can. So in the unlikely event of anyone listening to this who hasn't come across the YEN before, do you want to just explain sort of how it came about and what it is?
So the cereal yen was the first yen that was started and founded in 2012, which coincided with the Olympics, and started as the cereal yens, and most of the other yens are competitions. There was this sort of, let's have a yield competition. And all the other yens have built on the basis of that, and the network is really based in the science of understanding the crop, and measuring different metrics within the crop through the season, and then looking at how those relate to yield. But the last word in the yen is that network. So the important thing is that it's bringing growers, the industry, researchers all together so that everyone can benefit from the network and learning, so that we can all improve yields.
So how does it work then? If I'm a farmer with a field that I consider that I'd like to enter into the yen, what do I do?
Well, you go to the website, and depending on your crop, click the right crop. So let's pretend it's a bean crop. You click the bean yen. The bean yens are sponsored, so we usually have a lot of free spaces. So we have sponsors who will sponsor an entry. So you fill in a sponsorship request form and you get matched with a sponsor. And then we send you a welcome pack with some guided instructions. So we ask, you can take a soil sample and get a soil analysis. We ask you to fill in your field history and agronomy during the season, and growth stages when you go and visit the crop. You can send in some crop grab samples, so you can go out and take a leaf analysis, and then a grab sample, which is basically cutting the crop at ground level and sending it in just before harvest. And we can get lots of different parameters from that. And then your yield at the end of the day. And we use all of that data to produce a report that we send to an entrant, which benchmarks their individual crop with everyone else who entered that season. So you can see whether you're average or above average or below average. And that can help guide where you might want to make tweaks to see if you can increase yields. And then we have an annual conference where everyone can get together.
Cool. So how much is involved from a farm? You talk about soil sampling. I think most people will be familiar with that, and crop sampling, etc. Is there a huge amount of sort of admin that needs to go on during the growing season? Are there actions that farmers need to take in order to give you the information you need?
Yeah. So it's not the easiest of things. You do have to commit to doing it. So there are compulsory bits of information so that we can run the yield potential model, and then there are optional bits of information. But the more those are filled in, the less gaps we have in the data set, and the more we can learn from it. But yes, I'm not going to lie, that entrants do need to do some actions and fill some bits in. So.
Yeah, well, you'd expect to, and if you're going into it, whether it's a sponsored place or a paid space, you're essentially getting a huge amount of valuable and hopefully practical information back that you can use to increase your yields in the future. So there has to be an element of that going in there. So, I mean, from your experience, what feedback do growers particularly in the pea and bean sector, that's what we're most interested in today. But what feedback do they most value from you when they get their reports? You talked about sort of making tweaks in the future, and so are there elements that are really obvious that come up every year that farmers think, oh yeah, I could try that next year? Is it quite quite straightforward in that respect to try and take things forward?
Yeah, it can be. I think it really it can vary. And one of the pea yen and the bean yen have been running for less time than the cereal yens. They were initiated later on in the life cycle. So we have a smaller data set for those, but we are reaching those 5-year marks where we've been able to do some robust analysis to give our growers a bit more value. And it depends on what the growers put in. So when they get their reports, they can have a look through. So they, for example, we're seeing an association with higher yields where people have applied potassium and sulfur in beans, for example. So if you had your report and you flip to that page and you're below the average on those box and whisker plots, maybe next year you think, well, maybe I should put a bit more potassium on, a bit more sulfur, and that might just nudge your yields up a little bit. Another association we've found is harvest losses between shedding. So perhaps more timely harvest could increase those yields a little bit. So it gives you I mean, there's a lot of information, and we're not suggesting you change everything, but you could pick one or two things that might be an easy tweak or change that could make a difference to the yields you get.
I've not seen any of these reports before. I've seen the data that you produce at your conference, but it's quite a weighty tome, is it, that comes through to the farm at the end of the day?
Yeah. So if you think about everything we ask for, from the rotation, so the field history, the cultivations, how much fertilizer you've applied and fungicides, all the way through to all the crop metrics we analyze. So the soil analysis, the leaf analysis, the harvest index, the yields, all of that, all the way through the number of pods per shoot. That's all then benchmarked. So you get this really 30-40 page report on your crop from beginning to end. And it's a really I think I find it really interesting, but it's a really nice way that you could pick. So what could I think about changing, and you could look and see where you are in relation to everyone else. Yeah, I think I know that from the cereal yen, especially, growers really they take it away and they really look at it, and they come back to us with questions of, what does this mean and how can I make a change?
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Does it sort of often spark further questions? You sort of get a bit of information, and then it often sparks new ideas, and then that needs to be taken forward. Do you see quite a lot of that happening as well?
Yes, definitely. And at the conference, we usually have we have the yen team are all there, but also like PGRO. Obviously, the Pulse Yens are in partnership with PGRO, and they always attend, so they're always on hand also to have a chat and work through the report with and answer any questions.
So the cereal yen, as you said, has been going for about 12 years now. How similar or different is it to where the pea and bean yens are? And can you see sort of perhaps over a certain period of time, is there a sort of pattern where the yens become sort of stronger and stronger the longer they exist for? I mean, you said you've got 5 years now, but that's quite a substantial amount of data. But does it tend to get stronger the longer period of time that you can analyze information from?
It does. So although it's not necessarily the length of time, which also helps, it's also the number of entrants. So it's the yen's power comes from the number of data entries you have when you look at the data set, and also word of mouth for people saying, I found this useful, and maybe you could sign up and have an entry for free, see if you like it, see if you value it, and then join. But we can't so if you do a field trial in 1 year or 2 years, you're very limited to that one location, and that one soil type, and those 2 seasons. But if you have multiple entries from all over the UK and Europe, and you have multiple seasons, so last year we had a drought in the spring, this year we obviously have not had a drought in the spring, and then you can average that out. So you start to really learn what a typical crop is, where they're typically they hit those growth stages and for benchmarking. I mean, we don't have benchmarks for the pulses, peas and beans, but as we do for cereals and oilseeds. So we're hoping that by gathering this data, we can start to build those benchmarks. The ends really come from having that network and that large data set that covers so many different locations and seasons and different farming systems. Yeah, that's really in the power of it.
Yeah. So do you have a sense for what you're seeing in terms of pea and bean yields over the past 5 years? I mean, we've talked previously to Keith Costello on this podcast about how pea yields have really sort of flatlined and started. Are you seeing that in the data that you're getting?
Yes, we are. I mean, we look at our yen entrants, and there's a wide range, which is fantastic because that gives us power for when we do the analysis. We can really find associations because we have a breadth of yields. But yeah, I wouldn't say we're seeing it stagnating, but we're not seeing it going up loads. And there is scope. So we run the yield potential model, and we do have entrants that are getting really high yields. So there are farms that do it, and there are locations that do it. So it is possible with tweaks and the right season to increase pulse yields. But I think it's about, and I listened to the episode with Keith, and he, you know, I agree with everything he said, obviously, but it is about paying attention. And what you can get from entering the yen is pointers of perhaps where you might want to make a tweak. So you don't have to do all of it. You can go, well, actually, this is perhaps where I wasn't doing what everyone else is doing, or this is perhaps where my crop differed separated from its potential, for example, and you could tweak it there. So
what would you say that the difference is between using the yen to make improvements to your crop versus using a consultant or an agronomist, or, you know, all the other sort of different options that growers have out there nowadays to sort of analyze their performance year on year? Is there sort of something about the yen that you think sort of puts it in a slightly different category to some of those other options?
I think it's in the measurements that we take. So we take all of those detailed measurements on, you know, the majority of, depending on what options people do, but the majority of the entrants in that year. So you have a measured benchmark against everyone else. Whereas if your agronomist has training and comes out and can look at your crop, and hopefully you have someone like Keith who has loads of experience, but it's not technically quantified, measurable benchmarking with everyone else. So I wouldn't say it would never replace, but it's a different way of looking at the information, and it could offer you a more specific idea of where you might want to make a tweak, I think.
And do you find growers tend to sign up for it, the same growers sign up for it year on year, or is it a different set every year?
It's a mix, actually. We have a couple, I said, well, more than a couple of dedicated growers who really, you know, they really believe in it. They see the benefit and they sign up. They maybe change whether they sign up for whichever different crop yens, but we've had a few that have really followed through. I think the last couple of seasons haven't been great for the pea and bean yen, where they've chosen not to sow a pulse that year, so they've not come back. But we do have some really dedicated believers, which is fantastic, because we can also then start to, in larger analysis, we can start to follow through how they're doing on their farm and if they're making an increase from being in the yen.
And how are sign-ups going this year? Because it's been a pretty torrid year for people. A lot of people won't have got in perhaps some of the crops that they wanted to this spring as well. So is that reflected in the numbers?
It is reflected in the numbers, sadly. So we have lots of sponsored free places available. So there are lots of opportunities for people to try the yen for the first time if they wanted to, free of cost, other than they're needing to do the work. But there's no charge for it, and they get all of that benefit, and they can try it and see if it works for them. But yeah, unfortunately, the extremely wet weather and the fact that so many spring crops haven't gone in yet or are just going in is having an effect.
Yeah, that's not a surprise. I mean, we're sat here on the 19th of April, for those of you who aren't listening on the same day. So, things hopefully will have changed by then and people will get a period of decent weather where they can get on. But is there a sort of cut-off that when's the sort of latest application you can make to join the yen? Because presumably it needs to be at a reasonable time of the season to get all the information you need.
It does, yeah. So we do have a cutoff for the soil analysis, but it's never that hard and fast. We change it depending on the season. So I think that's being pushed a little bit later this year. But you can sign up and just submit a yield if you put in all of your other agronomy details. But the grower wouldn't necessarily get the benefit then of doing the leaf samples or the grab samples. So I would say once you've got your crop in the spring, then sign up.
Yeah. So the message, if you haven't got it already, is sign up as quickly as you can,
Yeah.
and take advantage of all of those important bits of analysis that you can benefit from. You talked about the free sponsored places. So how simple is it for someone to get one of those places? Is all the information online? Am I just is that the simplest thing to do?
It is, yes. So if you go
Yeah.
to the Yen website and follow either the bean yen or the pea yen or a different crop if you're interested, but the pea and bean yens have the sponsored places. And there's a sponsorship form. You just fill that in, and then you can get matched with a sponsor. So I think it depends on which variety you're using or which product you might be applying. So there are lots of avenues to getting one of those sponsored places, and then you can try it for free.
And as an avid listener to this podcast yourself, Charlotte, you will have obviously heard the various episodes we've done on the NCS project, and ADAS is a very important partner in that project. How does the NCS project? Well, I should say those who haven't heard about the NCS project, the Nitrogen Climate Smart project, have a look on our website and have a Google around at some of the articles about how alternative proteins can help cut carbon emissions from UK agriculture. It's a really exciting project. And as I say, ADAS is one of the many partners involved in that. How does the yen interact with the NCS project for those who might be interested in kind of both sides of the fence?
So within the NCS project, there are pulse pioneers who are being recruited to host trials on farm. And most of them are having, they have different trials, but most of them are having a split field with a cereal and a pulse. So both sides of those fields are being entered into the respective yen, and the following year that will also be entered into the yen. So there's that link with pulse pioneers automatically being entered into the pulse yens. And I would say that we're still looking for at least 2 pulse pioneers this season. So if anyone's interested in that, please get in touch with Boffin or PGRO. But also, I think that Pulse, if there are any Pulse Yen entrants listening, we are open. So if you're interested in looking at how your pulse crop and nitrogen residues can have an effect in the following crop, and with an on-farm field trial, then please, follow up with that. As well as that, the NCS project has been used, that those funds have been used to do the in-depth analysis on the pea and bean yen this season. So we've looked at all of the data since they started, and done a robust association analysis to try and look out what's associated with higher yields versus lower yields. And that's been really interesting. The P analysis report has been reported in the Pulse magazine, I think, and is available on Pulse PEP. And the bean one will be available soon. At the end of the month, it should be out on Pulse PEP. But there's that really nice link, I think, with Pulse Pioneers and feeding into the Pulse Yen.
Yeah, and similar, I think the other way, if you've already signed up to the yen and you're really interested in some of the elements of it, it might be that you could be a Pulse Pioneer as well. So perhaps get in touch with Charlotte advisors there and see if that's something that you want to take forward. There will be an event at Cereals where Boffin and PGRO and ADAS will be together for a period of time over the show, yet to be decided, but there will be some NCS project updates there, and I'm sure it'll be very welcome if you're interested in finding out more about the Yen's interaction with the NCS project. Then there'll be an opportunity to do that there. I think that's it for today, so thank you very much for joining us, Charlotte.
No, thank you for having me. It's nice to be on, actually. It's a new experience for me, so thank you.
Excellent. Well, you've been a dream interviewee, so thank you very much for joining us on that one. If you enjoyed the podcast and you want to be alerted every time there's a new episode, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and otherwise we'll catch you soon.